Welcome to Unlapped. We're back after what was a wild and entertaining and hot, for many reasons, Hungarian Grand Prix. And we've also got lots to break down ahead of Spa, the last race weekend before summer break. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave us a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. All right, let's get into it. Katie George, Nate Saunders, Laurence Edmondson. McLaren scored maximum points last weekend, and Oscar Piastri got his first career win. That should be the headline. That should be it. We should be applauding Oscar Piastri, one of the great young talents on the grid. However, we are going to talk about McLaren's team orders and what went down. Nate, you were on the ground. It felt like it should have been a McLaren celebration, and instead, the weekend just had a damper on it based on what played out on track.
Yeah, it definitely did. I think it felt a little bit like Piastri's big moment had been cheapened a little bit. I don't think it would have been for him, but it just, watching from the outside. And what kind of was telling, before the race, we're very lucky, Laurence and I, we often get passes to go onto the grid before the race, and you can kind of soak up some of that
Humble
atmosphere.
brag.
Yeah. A massive humble brag. Apologies to everyone listening. And you can talk to people, and kind of a lot of the time, people are basically at that point, all you have really to talk about is the race that's coming up, what people expect and stuff. And multiple people I spoke to, or just, in passing, some journalists. I spoke to one former team boss who now works for different television stations. You can work out who that is. And he was like, everyone was kind of like, I wonder how McLaren are going to mess this up today, because the narrative had become McLaren have now got this either quick car or the quickest car in Formula One, and they just keep not delivering on wins. And the idea of Lando and Oscar being next to each other on the grid, I think, set up a really kind of interesting dynamic there, because you had your quickest driver out in front and then Oscar. And Hungary is such a difficult place to keep the lead. If you're on pole, there's quite a long run down there. It's quite a tricky first corner to navigate. And often you're in a very, very defensive mode early on. So a couple of people said, what's going to happen in this race if Oscar gets ahead of Lando and stays there? And two things happen at the start. Oscar did get ahead of Lando, and then Lando spent a couple of laps dealing with that. The fact that Verstappen had got ahead of him, Verstappen eventually gave the position back. By the time he did, he was further down the road. Now, obviously, fast forward to that pit stop, the big controversial pit stop. Piastri should have won the race. We all know that. As you said, Katie, the right result did happen. But you still had a feeling like, what are McLaren going to do at this point? Because they had Lewis and Max were there. The pace kept kind of fluctuating between everyone. At one point, Piastri had gone off, and he'd lost quite a bit of time, both with that and with the traffic that he'd been kind of navigating. And we were watching the times, and we were thinking at some points Lando was in it, and then he was out. And then all of a sudden, Piastri comes out from his stop, and he's behind Norris. And it was this moment of, oh my God, this is now a team orders situation. This is now a PR nightmare for the team, because you're right. Like the headline news from this is McLaren not just had a 1-2 and scored maximum points, but they had their best race weekend in over a decade, in living memory, really, because they got the 1-2 in qualifying and the 1-2 in the race. I mean, teams would kill for that, to do that even once a season. And yet the way this all played out at the end, the fact that Lando at the end looked pretty pissed off with everything. I don't know if you saw the weird tense exchange he had with like Lewis in the cool down room, but his body language in the press conference that I was in afterwards was a bit strange. And he was doing the Lando thing where he talks for a long, long time, and you can tell that he's kind of, he's just talking as he thinks, and it's not always the best thing, because he'll say stuff that maybe isn't the smartest thing to say. And then Chris Medland, who I believe we've had on the show once or twice in Austin, said when he was down at the photo taking place for the win, Norris looked very sheepish there. Now, it's not unusual to see a driver who's been beaten by their teammate look a bit sheepish when the celebration's for them. But it just, there was a weird vibe going on from the whole thing. So I think that for that to be the case is, and we'll get into it now, obviously, but I think McLaren handled it pretty badly. I think we got an insight into the fact that McLaren are probably still struggling a little bit with this concept of being at the front now. You have to be aware of these situations. But also, they've got a very good problem in the fact that the reason we don't have Red Bull having this issue all the time is because Perez is never anywhere near Max Verstappen. We always talk about, and Zach Brown has kind of cheekily said, we're going to win the constructors because of Perez. He might be right in that sense, but he has a problem that Red Bull have a very big problem with Perez. But McLaren have the problem that if these two guys keep being close together, we've already seen Lando, if he hadn't done the right thing there, I think it would have been a complete nightmare. If he hadn't moved over, them managing that going forward would have been awful. The fact that he did, I think, has saved some goodwill, but it showed you that team orders is going to have to be a thing because I think they're going to be close more often. And the very concept of it, certainly for Lando Norris, is maybe a harder one to deal with because let's not forget, it's not like he's won 20 races and Piastri hadn't won any. He's just won one. He feels like he should have won a few more. And now Piastri's got his first one. So I think from this season keeps developing these great narratives and these great storylines. This is just an added bonus to the fact that we have this McLaren Red Bull situation, and it's almost complete contrasts. You've got two great drivers, and at one team, one great driver, and driver struggling at another, and both those things come with very, very different kind of consequences, if you want to call it that. So yeah, being on the ground was just fascinating, seeing it play out. But it was just I found it quite telling that a lot of people thought that was going to be the case in some way or other, that McLaren were going to end up doing something that meant the race was less than. And as it turned out, it was a perfect race. But yeah, they kind of turned it into a bit of a nightmare for themselves.
You make a great point. It has been so fun as a fan and somebody who covers the season. It's been a great season. We've had all kinds of different storylines and narratives to follow. Laz, I'll turn to you. I'll make you judge, jury, and executioner, jury, judge, executioner, whatever that is.
Judge, Judy, and executioner. If you go
yeah, you'll be Judge Judy for us on this lovely episode of Unlapped. Who's to blame for the controversy? Do you put more of the onus on McLaren and the team orders and how they handled it in the moment, or do you put more of it on Lando Norris?
No, it was a strategy. So it was the decision to pit Lando Norris first, because that was always going to mean that he ended up, once they've both done their pit stop, ahead, because it's a circuit where there's a huge advantage to putting on fresh tyres. And of course, Lando Norris took advantage of that and therefore got ahead. Now, they actually said before Lando's pit stop, the idea of this pit stop is not to undercut Oscar. The idea is basically to protect ourselves from Lewis. But if you look at where Lewis was, the tyres he was on, the fact he'd already made his pit stop, so it was going to be on older, harder tyres, because McLaren still had some mediums left to put on, which is what they put on the car. I don't think he was that much of a threat. I really don't. Even if they had a horrible pit stop and Norris had dropped behind, I still think that he might have been able to. I think he probably would have found a way back past. So there was all of this, and it's that thing that F1 teams do. Of course, an F1 team is, runs everything based on data, figures, best possible outcomes, and then working backwards from there. And the best possible outcome, of course, was the 1-2. The best way to ensure that was to make sure they pitted in a sequence that protected as much as possible from Lewis Hamilton, and therefore as much as possible from a dodgy pit stop. So that's the way they did it. But I don't think it was necessary in this instance. I think, Lando pitted on lap 45, Oscar pitted on lap 47. I really don't think it would have been a problem at all if Oscar pitted on 45 and Lando on 46, or 46 and 47, but always with Oscar first. And so often is the case, in racing. I remember when we had Mercedes fighting each other, and often when Red Bull have had two drivers fighting each other, the lead driver, the driver who's leading on track, will get the first pit stop, almost always, unless there is a real threat from behind. But even then, it's very unusual to shuffle the drivers intentionally as well. So I put it down to the strategy. I think, Lando was put in a very difficult position, but he said afterwards that he was always going to do it. He initially was going to wait until the last lap.
Final corner of the last lap.
Final corner, last lap. I mean, but then, of course, you run this huge risk, and this is probably why he was thinking that, of if anything happens in between, so a safety car, for example, you can't change position if there's a safety car. So if there's a safety car that takes you across the line, then that's it. You've won the race. And then, of course, if it's a safety car, you do restart before the end of the race, you back everyone up together again. And therefore, it's a situation where giving a position back would put them really at threat of whoever's in third place. Again, red flag situation, you start again from the grid, and it's very hard to get back that position. So perhaps that's why Lando was thinking, right, I'm going to do what the team said, but I'm going to push it as far as possible to get a potential advantage from it.
Well, that's what was interesting with that, because he claimed afterwards that it was only when they reminded him or said to him, we're worried about the safety car, that he then, I think he said it in the post-race press conference, he said, I would have looked like a bit of an idiot had that happened. So I wasn't sure. I agree with you there, Laurence, because I think Lando Norris clearly knew that was an outcome. I mean, it's not like he suddenly forgot that safety cars can happen, but it's just interesting afterwards that he was already kind of spinning the narrative of kind of what he was thinking. But I do think he was in a tough position, and most drivers shouldn't be put in that situation, I think, anyway.
And what other possible reason would you not give back the position sooner? What other possible reason would you wait until the end? There's no obvious reason to do that.
Yeah.
You know, if as long as Oscar's got a big enough gap to Lewis, which you know the team were able to inform him of, then you know you do it quickly. But the thing is, and the thing where this strategy kind of fell flat a bit as well was, you know, what if something had gone wrong with Oscar's pit stop and he had fallen right back towards Lewis, you know, and then Lando has to give up a huge amount of time. And so inevitably they were going to give up some race time by doing this swap as well. So I think, you know, there was, you know, if you boil it right down to what's the absolute safest way to guarantee a 1-2, it probably was the way they did it. And of course they got their 1-2. But I think there was so much potential for things to go wrong, for drama and all the rest of it, that it just wasn't worth, you know, that little bit of extra safety net. It just wasn't worth it for the potential ramifications. Now, perhaps McLaren would turn around and say, well, you know, even if Lando didn't give it back, we still would have got our 1-2, and that's what matters to us. But I think that would have created so many issues down the road that the team would have absolutely regretted that decision had it turned out that way.
We obviously know they're ultra competitive individuals. They're one of 20 that do this. Nobody wants to relinquish, even to their teammate, a place or a victory. Lando Norris, to your point, Laz, he hasn't won a whole lot yet. He's on the up and up of his career. But as harsh as this is going to sound, maybe it comes down to looking in the mirror a little bit, because this is a really interesting stat, Nate, that you pulled before the show. Lando Norris has been on pole 5 times and has lost the lead each time before or at turn 1.
Yep.
Maybe 2 times, 3 times you chalk that up to like coincidence, bad luck. But I would have to believe that as a team, as a driver, that's a deeper problem. Would you not agree?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's, and we were talking about narratives, weren't we? I mean, that is kind of the narrative now. I think less so, it's still around McLaren a little bit, but you look at it and it is Lando. You know, Lando was the one who should have won all those races between Miami and and including Hungary. And when you're pole, it doesn't matter whether the rundown to turn 1 is long or not. You should be the guy that is in the lead coming out of turn 1. So, and it's, he said afterwards he lost the race there, and he was right. And he did the same in Spain, didn't he? Max got past him at turn 1. So, yeah, I think that's becoming the thing with Lando. And you know, we know how talented Lando is, but I think that's where the two of them are very different in that sense. I think Piastri, it feels a little bit like the Sainz-Leclerc situation at Ferrari, in a sense of Charles, you know how good he is, and he's also got all those pole positions, and so many haven't been converted in. And I think Sainz is probably closer to Norris than Sainz is relative to Leclerc, but he is a lot less peaky in his performances, and there's a lot less moments where you feel like, could he have done better on race day after qualifying? So I think that's becoming quite an interesting thing. But we can talk about the radio messages in a sec. I just wanted to hear what whether Laurence agrees that Norris is becoming a bit of a choke artist when it comes to these things. Maybe a strong way of putting it, but he is letting wins go on the table. And I think that is another reason it took him so long to do it, is because he has blown some of these opportunities. He knows he should be closer to Max. I think he spent all those laps ignoring what Will Joseph was telling him, not because he was going to do it on the final lap, because I think for a long time with that, he was like, no, I ain't giving this back. I want to be the world champion. And eventually, I think he had too long to think about it. He was eventually coaxed down from like the precipice. But yeah, I definitely think that's weighing on him quite heavily now.
Yeah, do I think he's becoming a choke artist? Well, before anyone goes off and Google's Google's Lando Norris's pole positions, 2 of those were in sprint races, because I was like, wait a minute, has he had 5 pole positions? But actually, yeah, two were in sprint races. One was China this year, where of course he lost out to Lewis Hamilton, then got hung out to dry. There was Spain, which, you know, we talked about, he lost the position to Max Verstappen. Then there was Budapest, where he lost it to Oscar. And then the other pole position in a race was Sochi, which is a really hard place. I mean, that is
tough. I'll give him that.
It doesn't matter how long the run is, but the longer that run is, you know, the harder it is to maintain pole position. So if you look at all of those races, there is the case that often at those races, it is harder to maintain pole position than, say, somewhere like Monaco, where you're pretty much guaranteed it unless you really mess up your start. But it's clear that something is not going quite right in his start process. And, you know, this is nothing new. I remember during the Lewis Hamilton, Nico Rosberg years, there was a lot of focus on race starts, because often that would decide which way a race went when 2 drivers were so evenly matched, to the point that, you know, they were practicing them away from the car. They had like in their rooms, they had a steering wheel set up to practice, just the motion of what you need to do. So it seems with Lando as well, the weird thing is that I think it's the same in Spain as it was in Hungary, but certainly in Hungary, it wasn't the initial getaway that was the issue. It was the second phase of the start. So I don't know whether that's all on him or whether he said it was when he pulled second gear. There was either a delay or it didn't, quite feed in the torque and the power. Remember, there's so much going on with the power unit in terms of the way that the turbo is compensated with electrical energy and all the rest of it. But clearly there's something that's not quite right there. So he needs to work with his engineers, and it may be a driver issue, but it may not be. In terms of his defense, I mean, I felt he was actually very, very robust in his defense with Oscar down into turn one. He was, if he'd given him any less room, he would have put his teammate in the wall, and then we'd be talking about that. So it's a tough one. But if it is clearly something he's doing wrong in his phase of the way he's getting the car away from the grid, then that absolutely needs to be his focus, because right now it's kind of the odd win here, the odd win there. I still don't really think we've got a title battle on our hands, even though the gap slightly narrowed in Hungary. But for next year and for his career going forward, if he's going to win championships, things like starts will win you and lose you championships. Certainly if it's a theme across several races.
Yeah, I agree with you on the title fight. I think just one thing as well that was really strange, and I thought that this added to the kind of bizarreness of the situation, is the way the communication between Lando and McLaren from the moment that, like, from that 49 onwards, I thought was so curious and so bizarre, because obviously what they were asking him to do was move over. I mean, the way they first couched it was, can you reestablish the order at your convenience, which is a great quote. It's like Felipe Fernando's faster than you. Obvious what he means, just couched in a very, very kind of bizarre way. But I don't know about you guys, but it sounded like they were asking a friend to do them a favor rather than telling a driver, you need to move over now. They should have explained the situation to him, maybe, because I don't know whether, because often drivers don't have an idea of what has happened to a driver, to their teammate or to drivers behind, etc. And I just thought the messages, I mean, Will Joseph was like, Lando, think of all our meetings, think of the children, Lando, think of McLaren, think of, it was kind of, I just found that very bizarre. And I wrote in the piece on Sunday night, it was obvious what Lando was being told, but I just don't think you can ever give a driver that gray area and say, okay, well, here's what's going on. And I think it's part of a bigger thing with McLaren that we see with these messages, because in Silverstone, if you remember, they had that message to Lando where they said, do you want to cover Lewis or do you want to cover Max?
That's right.
And it was a very vague gray area question, and what they got back was a very indecisive answer, and they made a very indecisive decision that contributed to them losing that race. So I'm not linking the two perfectly, but I think that the more you actually analyze the way that communication, that Will Joseph Lando Norris relationship is, it does seem a bit strange. And I was really surprised that Andrea Stella didn't step in, because often we see Toto Wolff stepping in for Mercedes and saying, hey, enough of this now,
where they lay down the law.
Yeah, like, I don't want to say this again. And when Lewis or George hear Toto, that is, especially if they're coming through a corner telling them he can win the race. But there's been times when the two drivers have been fighting. So I was surprised they didn't get that. But yeah, I think that to add to, maybe a defense for Lando, I just think the radio, it was clear, but this is an F1 driver we're talking about. You've got to, especially when he thinks he can be world champion, you've got to be so much more clearer than that. Clear is probably not the right word, but I was just surprised they never explicitly said to him, move over.
More forceful, a little bit more forceful maybe with the recommendation. But I would just say hindsight's always 20/20. So thinking back on it, I wondered in the moment if Lando had immediately acquiesced when he was requested to move over and let Oscar Piastri through. I wondered if he had done that initially, right when they asked, would then he have had more race time in front of him to maybe naturally overtake and shown that he had the pace and the ability to win the race on his own? I felt like by dancing, right, going back and forth, as you mentioned, Nate, with his engineer, that he wasted valuable time that he possibly could have just let him through and then tried to win the race in his own right.
Yeah, it's a good point.
I think had he done that, that would have been a far less controversial way of winning than just staying ahead and taking the victory by virtue of the pit stop. But I think also, and I don't have this absolutely confirmed, I wasn't in Hungary, but judging by the radio messages earlier in the race, Will Joseph told Lando that you have until the mid-40s to race what he called the other papaya car, the other McLaren. So basically that was saying, we have up until the final pit stops to race. And then it's often the case within a team that after that final pit stop, you hold your order, because 1-2s are incredibly difficult to come by. Remember, the last one that McLaren got was at Monza with Daniel Ricciardo and Lando back in 21. Am I right in saying that? I think 21. So yeah, that is a very common situation that teams will have, is that we'll get to the final pit stop and then the actual battling for position stops from there. I agree with Nate. I think it would have been helpful if Andrea Stella had stepped in, but I don't think Lando can use it as an excuse. I think he knew absolutely what the deal was. They probably should have been more explicit before the pit stop and said, they said the aim is not to undercut Oscar, but it became clear on Lando's outlap that he was going to undercut Oscar. So what they probably should have said before he pitted was like, right, Lando, we're pitting you now. The aim is not to undercut Oscar, and if we do, you have to give back the position immediately. That would be the obvious thing to do. So it's there before the pit stop, and then rather than saying, well, remember what we said in the briefing, or think about how you're going to need the team and Oscar to win championships, he could just reference his earlier message. He said, I told you earlier, the only reason we pitted you that lap was that. But that again is the benefit of hindsight, and I think probably they were a little bit naive going into this, believing that Lando would play along and would do what was right, and of course eventually he did. So I think the other thing, not to be too harsh on Will Joseph and how he went about his messaging, is that each engineer probably understands their driver better than anybody else in the Formula One paddock, apart from perhaps the driver's parents. And so their understanding of what will actually get through and what will cut through and what won't antagonize and make the driver do the opposite of what you want, is crucial. And so I think there's that psychological element of every race car engineer who has to kind of coach their driver through. They have to be the friend at the end of the line who's kind of like telling them, do this, do that. And he even said at some point, I think, I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to, protect you here.
Protect you,
was the word. So I think, when you look at it like that and the reasons why the language he used, I think it's because in his mind, and I'm not going to argue with him because, I think he knows Lando a lot better than I do, that was the best way to cut through to Lando. And ultimately, he was successful, and actually before the final lap as well. So, I think we have to take into context what actually happened as opposed to what it looked like was going to happen for several laps.
Yeah, and what's sad about all this is we've had a great, fascinating conversation for, 15, 20 minutes at this point, and we haven't even mentioned Oscar Piastri and what a drive that was by him and the job that he did getting his first career win, Nate. And that's the problem I have with what went down in Budapest.
Yeah, and you could tell after. I mean, all of the questions in the press conference, there was maybe one to Oscar. But I've got to say, I mean, Piastri, he's such a cool character, isn't he? He's so collected. He doesn't. I was trying to explain this, what I meant to another journalist. I know he's Australian. He doesn't, like, a lot of Aussies you get in sports are very kind of like a bit like Danny Ricciardo, very, very extroverted. And he's kind of like an introverted Australian in the fact that he still has that kind of cheekier spell to him, but he's just so calm and collected. You can imagine him just going surfing for 3 hours a day and just, just getting back up again and just going back on the waves. There's something very steely and cool about the way he goes about things. And I think that, getting his first win in his second season. I mean, it took Lando, 6 seasons to do it? 5 seasons? I'm trying to do the quick math. I think it was 5, but 110 races. I think it took Lando for him to do it in just under 40. Really, really big for him. Really, really impressive. And I think he's 40 points down on Lando now. So if those situations come up again later in the year and McLaren feel like they are in a championship fight, I think Oscar will kind of bear the brunt of that. But to Lawrence's point earlier, I think a lot of this has to be couched with what would happen in 2025, and the fact that Piastri has kind of got that off of his back as well. Like, I haven't won yet. I think that's always a big moment for drivers. So great news for McLaren. And actually, I think that Oscar has maybe been chipping away a little bit at Lando. He's maybe had a bit less luck. He's still maybe showing up that he's a bit less experienced than Lando. But give that a year or two, and I wouldn't be surprised if those two guys are much, much closer. I still feel like Lando's the better driver of the two right now. He's got a bit more experience. We've seen a lot more from him. But there's a reason Zach Brown went through the courts to get Piastri, and we're seeing it. We're seeing it now. Like this, this guy is really special. So great to see him win. And you're right, Katie. Like, it's good of you to give him some props, because like even after I wrote the Sunday night piece on ESPN.com, I think I mentioned Piastri, but I read half of it. I was like, I've barely mentioned the race winner here, which is always a bit of a blow. So yeah, he's great, and he's got a great career ahead of him.
Yeah, he really does. I want to go back to Judge Judy real quick before we put a bow on Hungary. There was controversy between our favorites, Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton, a lovely rivalry that is the gift that just keeps on giving. They collided, obviously, towards the end of the race, Laz. Max still finished in the points, but it ruined his race. Max made it clear, I don't think that this surprises any of us, that he thought he was the aggrieved party. Lewis Hamilton, of course, thought that Max Verstappen was in the wrong. Where do you fall between the two when they collided?
So I think it's a little bit more complicated than it first seemed. When I first saw it, I thought it was Max's fault. But if you look at what Max was arguing, it was that Lewis was turning in. And if you look at the onboards and you look at the offboards, Lewis is turning in. Now, what the stewards found was that Lewis was actually just taking the normal line. And this is why we can't really have one single rule about turning under braking that applies to every single situation, because corners are very different. So the Austria example, it's a very different type of corner. It's, it almost turns the same amount of degrees, but it does it in a much sharper way. So, it's much more about a quick turn in, and whereas with the first corner at Hungary, you have to be quite slow, coax the car in, a little bit more whilst being on the brakes as well. So I don't really think Lewis did anything wrong, and therefore didn't get penalised. And then in terms of what Max did, well, the stewards found that he hit the brakes at the same point he had the previous lap, but he was going significantly faster because he had the DRS open. So that meant that, he really was leaving his braking to the very, very last moment. And he said he locked up because Lewis started to turn in on him. But I think realistically, he was always going to go deep into that corner. What is fascinating is that I think, I'm guessing here entirely, but I would say about 17, 18 drivers on the grid give Max that corner, see what's happening, bail out and go wide. Lewis doesn't do that anymore. Ever since 2021, Lewis has got to a point where he's like, if you want to overtake, you got to do it the hard way. And any kind of, banzai moves down the inside like that, you've got to make it work by yourself. And so, I think Lewis knew a little bit that, he wasn't going to give him an inch whatsoever. And then perhaps that led to the lockup of Max. Of course, Max initiated it, therefore is arguably more to blame. But while stewards shouldn't take into account the end result, they're not meant to say, if Lewis continues on to third, then we won't give a penalty. But I think had Lewis been taken out in that incident and not finished or dropped 6 places or something, then I think we probably may have seen a bit of a harsh penalty for Max. But so a very complicated incident, but a good example of why one rule does not fit every single incident. And starting to shout over the team radio about my wheel was ahead of his, or he turned in on me beyond the braking point and all that kind of stuff, it doesn't really work. Every incident is different, needs to be taken on its own merits or demerits depending on what happens.
It felt like that was the cherry on top of what was already a very frustrating afternoon for Max Verstappen. This has been his longest wait since 2021 between wins. And obviously we heard radio messages where he was very frustrated with the team about their strategy. Laz, you have an article on ESPN.com right now about it. How much pressure is mounting for Red Bull? Nate, you earlier, you talked about Sergio Perez and the struggles that we've seen from him. But we are used to sheer dominance from Red Bull, and we haven't necessarily seen that in the past couple of weekends.
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation at Red Bull right now. And I think the backdrop being what happened at the start of the year, and also not being 100% sure about Max's future, all adds to it. Because it's not unusual for Max Verstappen to be upset with his team if the strategy is not good, if the car's not performing. We've heard messages between him and his race engineer, GP, just which are like off the scale in terms of humor to some extent, and irony being dished out, but also bad language and anger and all the rest of it. But yeah, what's not entirely clear is whether this Max anger was purely just because of a bad result and the fact that there was an update on the car that didn't really deliver what they needed. It certainly didn't put them in contention to beat the McLaren's this weekend, or whether it does speak to this wider, deeper schism that's being created at Red Bull. And I'm not yet in a position where I'm ready to say either way. I don't think, I don't think it's entirely clear, because if they go and win in Spa quite comfortably with, a track that suits their car a little bit better, and they go and beat the McLaren's, then I think it does change the picture over again. But we've got to keep a very close eye on what Max is saying and how he's talking about his team, because he kind of gave the impression that not everybody at the team sees this drop in performance as a severe issue as he does, and perhaps not everybody is on the same wavelength as him about making sure it's rectified. So I think there is a little bit of division starting to build there. Whether this is just because Max is such a competitor and won't let any single point or position go without having some kind of outburst and anger about it, or whether this speaks to something much deeper is very interesting. At the moment I can't really tell. Nate, you may have had a better idea been in Hungary.
No, I think that's about accurate. I mean, I would say the only thing that I picked up in Hungary was definitely that about the tensions. I mean, Jos Verstappen has just come back to the paddock in the last couple of races, and I know people might hear that and say, well, yeah, he's Max's dad. Like, of course he's back. But he kind of took an involuntary hiatus from going to the Red Bull hospitalities. From what I understand, it was actually Oliver Mintzlaff, who's one of the big dogs at Red Bull. I think he's CEO at Red Bull, at the Red Bull company itself, rather than the Red Bull team, because this situation between him and Horner had just got so toxic around the Bahrain Grand Prix, and him coming back into the fold, I think, has added to the tension. Jos is very, very well known for going out and giving, quotes to the Dutch when stuff hasn't gone wrong. I don't want to pin it all on Jos either, because I think that there's clearly some divisions of that team. The Christian Horner situation at the start of the year, there's a lot of people in the team that's that just hasn't sat well with, obviously. So there's lots going on, and I think that as well. Let's not forget, and Katie, you mentioned it, but the Perez situation is there as well. And I think if you're Max, and I haven't heard this is me speculating, but if you're this Red Bull car is clearly becoming a lot more difficult to drive on the limit now. That's we're seeing that over and over again. He is carrying almost all the water for that team at the moment. Perez is barely making it past Q1, and we said it a lot, didn't we? Last year that was not an issue. It was just, okay, well, that's kind of embarrassing, but they were 200 points ahead in the Constructors' Championship this time last year. Now they're looking over their shoulders and they're thinking we could lose this. So I think it's all of that coming together, and it's very much a team that's had their own way for a long time. You just become used to that, and I'm not saying they've become complacent in that sense, but just when things start going, things become difficult. It can bring out a lot of things that you didn't realize were there before. So yeah, and to go back to the point that Laurence made actually about Will Joseph and Lando, GP is the perfect person for Max in those situations. He's always been like that. He's been very, very direct with him. And apparently that is, the two of them are like that. They'll just go back and forth a lot all the time. And GP knows Max doesn't respect it if I don't go back to him as hard as he kind of gives it back to me. So I think that's kind of their process as well. It plays out in a big way. Max, it's a bit like Yuki and a lot of the drivers, to be honest. When we can often forget that these guys are giving these radio messages and they're driving, they're driving Formula One cars, and they're hot and they're bothered, and they're trying to work out strategies, and they're all of these things. And so when they sound a bit flustered or a bit angry, as Max did, it's like, well, no wonder. Like I know what happens to me when someone moves across me on the motorway at 60 miles an hour. I get a bit hot under the collar myself, right? So I think that is part of it as well. But yeah, there's clearly, I think if we get to Zandvoort, especially after the summer break, his home race, if they're still in a situation where he feels like they're not maximizing things, I think that will be a real, that could be a real kind of key flashpoint in this season for Red Bull, because I don't think there's any way Max wants to go to his home race and be in the same situation. So yeah, I think that is definitely a kind of a narrative and a theme to keep an eye on as we get kind of into the middle and the end of the year that's coming up.
Yeah, it's gonna be really interesting to see how they fare in Spa, and then obviously when we go into summer break. I do have some good news. Well, I think it's good news because I'm a big fan of the person that we're going to talk about next. Mattia Binotto is returning to Formula One after a brief hiatus. He was the former Ferrari team principal, but he's back on the grid, Laz, and he's joining Audi. And I want to know in what capacity, because he was the team principal at Ferrari, but that's not exactly the role he'll be in with Audi.
Yeah, it's not entirely clear on the structure that's there, because they don't really have a team principal right now, or previously. So his official role will be Chief Operating Officer and Chief Technical Officer. Now, lots of teams have those roles. They're not usually as high profile as the team principal, but I think in reality he'll be a team principal. But I always felt that Binotto was better suited to a more technical, leading the technical team, almost a technical director role, than he was a team principal role at Ferrari anyway. And of course, he not only has the background as a team principal at Ferrari, as a technical director at Ferrari, overseeing the chassis side, his main background comes from the engine side, is where he started out at Ferrari. And of course, Audi are bringing this brand new engine project to fruition in 2026. So, you know, I think in many ways you can understand why he's got the credentials to take on that role. The question is, what's happened that Andreas Seidel's been booted out from the position of CEO, and they've brought Binotto in. And you know, I think to answer that question, you probably have to look a little bit further up the chain, because in September last year, Gernot Dorner was took over from Marcus Duisman. Duisman was the guy who had actually announced the return, or the arrival of Audi into Formula One. And so it seems like Gernot Dorner has a number of different opinions on how Audi, not the F1 team, but Audi as a whole, needed to be run going forward, and you know, wanted to bring a few things in on the car side, and just the general kind of way the whole company operates. And it seems like now there's also been a decision to make some changes on the F1 side, possibly because if you look at Sauber right now, which is the team that Audi has taken over, the progress is pretty poor. And it's very hard to believe that a team that is struggling as much as Sauber is now in 2024 will have anything like a car, let alone the engine project, which is difficult in itself, but a car capable, a chassis capable of fighting for victories, which of course is what Audi want to do. Realistically, they probably know not initially, but you know, not in the too distant future. And so I think by making these changes now, if you know, they were looking at the whole project, they were saying there's a lot wrong with this, there's a lot that hasn't really changed, and there's a lot that hasn't moved in the direction we'd hoped it had, you know, since they started investing in Sauber. Perhaps now they've made a decision to take you know, this major kind of structural leadership change now, so that when they're in 2026, it's stabilized a bit, and it's a lot better than get into 2026 realizing it's wrong 1 year into the project, firing someone, then trying to bring in someone. Then, you know, I think that would have been a real mess. So you can kind of understand why they did it, but it does hint that perhaps the whole project is not where it's supposed to be at this stage.
I'd just like Gunnar to hear me out. If they need to freshen up the logo, the iconic Audi logo, you could just
so good.
use Mattia's glasses in the center. Okay. If you haven't Googled, if you don't know what Mattia Binotto looks like, you're clearly missing out. So please go Google him, and it'll make a lot of sense.
I saw that. Yeah. That's such a good meme. That is what it should, that should be the logo now until he leaves.
It should.
But he needs to get those glasses as well, doesn't he? I mean, like,
yeah,
surely
yeah,
they can manufacture those up out of carbon fiber.
It's like the 2000 glasses that everybody wore when we came into the new year.
Great look.
I was tempted. So I'm working on another project where I've got Mattia's number from. So I've spoken to him recently, and I thought to myself, should I just send him this meme? Because I'm going to ask and see if we can get him on the pod at some point. I'm sure he'll say go through the official Audi channels, etc. But yeah, I might send him the meme and just say, hey, I saw this, thought it was funny. See what he says.
Yeah, I would love to know his response. And I'm curious, Nate, Laz, you kind of alluded to the timing of it. Carlos Sainz still has not given us any indication what his future holds. Obviously, Audi's in the mix. We know Williams is probably the front runner at this point. Does Mattia joining ranks with Audi sway Carlos Sainz in any way?
It's a tough one to say, because on the surface you'd think so, but then of course Sainz drove for McLaren when Seidel was there, and you know, was part of that team as well. So I think it might do, though, because I do know for a fact that Binotto was really high on Sainz as a talent. You know, it's why he signed him. You know, they went through a really big evaluation process, and they were really impressed with Sainz. They really went after him, you know, in a big way there. So it may do. But I think that the thing with Sainz is, to everything Laurence said, that has been the bigger issue for Carlos Sainz not wanting to commit. You know, it's such a risky longer term proposition. So if rather than looking at it as he's worked with Binotto before, that might sway him. if Sainz looks at it and says Binotto is a better bet at fixing some of the problems we believe exist behind the scenes with Audi, the fact that if you talk to anyone in the paddock right now, they're like, yep, they're going to be rubbish when they come in. Just they're not where they need to be. It may well be that he looks at that and says, okay, maybe we'll be a bit more competitive in 26 with Binotto. I say we, like, if he was to join. Sure. So it could do. I mean, it certainly, let's put it this way, it won't have hurt their chances of getting him. I think that the one thing you could look at it is say, why are you changing management 18 months out? Does that actually signify to Carlos Sainz, okay, great, I love Binotto, but that just looks like a massive kind of dumpster fire situation over there. Don't want to go there. Because that is one way you could look at that as well. But yeah, Binotto being there will definitely, Sainz will know him. Sainz will continue those conversations with Audi. But I think ultimately, I just don't think Audi is the sort of project you can commit to without being pretty worried that there's going to be a few years of some pain. I mean, Nico Hulkenberg has already signed up to it, but he wasn't even racing in Formula 1 2 years ago. He's kind of happy to be there. For Sainz, it's a much bigger decision, but hopefully it's had a good impact, because I think that all of us want to see Carlos sort his future out sooner rather than later.
Let's look ahead to Spa. I'm going to shortchange the conversation just a little bit, because obviously we had a lot to get to after Hungary. When you look at the track here, who do you think is best suited to perform at Spa?
I think if Red Bull aren't competitive, then they're going to be really worried. I mean, of course they're going to be competitive, but if they're not in it to win it, and right at the very front, then they're going to be really concerned, because slowly these other teams, be it Mercedes or McLaren, have been chipping away their advantage. And we saw in Silverstone that it was in mixed conditions, cool conditions, but the Mercedes was very quick, high speed corners. So again, the Mercedes, should be fast there as well. But it really should be a Red Bull, should be a Max Verstappen victory, at least anyway. I mean, Perez will, hopefully for his own sake, put together a decent performance, a clean qualifying, somewhere in Q3 at the very least, ideally, top 4 or so, and have a sensible race to put his chances back on track if he can at this stage. But yeah, I think Red Bull is going to go in there as a team to beat still, despite the difficulties they've had, despite not winning a race for 3 races in a row. But if they're not quick there, then it really does start to open things up later in the season.
Yeah, and we'll have a fun summer break talking all about Red Bull, I'm sure, for all the wrong reasons, because we've been talking about Red Bull for 2 years now, it feels like, for all the right reasons. Okay, here's how the podium predictions currently stand. I lucked out because I was at Summer League last week, and I just haphazardly sent in my text, and I got 2 right. So maybe I should just start doing that, just stop caring, and then maybe good things will come my way. I'm in the lead with 15 points, which means maybe I can get a little crazy here with my predictions. Nate, close behind at 12. Laz, you got 1 point this weekend with Norris coming in P2. You've got 11 points. So with that, Nathaniel, you get to start.
Yeah, I got 0 points this week. Is that right?
Yep, and that's why I'm allowing you to start to get your picks.
Good. Just had to clarify. I'm really struggling with this one, honestly, because it used to be a safe bet for us, right? You could just put Max first. I'm gonna say, I'm gonna put Lewis in third, Max in second, and I think Lando's gonna be pretty fired up after what happened last week. I think we get Lando beating Max, which, to Lawrence's point, would suggest that maybe Red Bull go into summer break a little unhappy. I'm kind of rolling the dice a little bit there, but
he's rooting for chaos. That's what
that would be a pretty fun outcome.
Yeah, would be
to this.
That's a good one. Okay, Laz, how you feel?
I'm going to go for Lando in third place, Lewis second, and Max win.
Oh, you're gonna do the same
one.
Damn
you. Why don't I let you guys go first? As the host, I should just be a tyrant and say, I'm going first. This is a dictatorship. All right. Okay, so you basically have done you have Lando winning, Nate. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Lewis. Oh, wait, I got to go backwards. All right. I'm going to go Lando coming in P3. Now it's gotten R-rated. Okay, Lando's coming in P3, Max Verstappen in P2, and I'm going to go with Lewis.
I love that.
I mean, I would love to see it, obviously, but we all have some kind of variation of those 3 drivers.
Yeah.
Let's see who comes out on top. Who's going to Spa, by the way?
Sorry.
I'm going to Spa.
You're going to Spa. Okay. Perfect.
I'm going to Spa.
Yeah, which is it's funny, isn't it? This point in the season, lads, there's some great races coming up. This is like the historical part of the season. So good fun. I just want to point out a quick stat that I've bored Laurence with already, but at the end of April, Max was on a stream and he said someone played down his stream the British national anthem, and he was like, "Oh, I haven't heard that much recently." Obviously, because McLaren, you hear the British national anthem and the Australian. It's now been played more since he said that than the Dutch national anthem has after a race. I just wanted to point that out as a proud Brit trying to fly the flag. I just think it's funny. It's one of those great stats you see flying around.
Yeah.
Leave
it to the internet.
He has a chance to level it up this weekend. But yeah, just thought I'd end the pod on that rather jingoistic British note.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Quinn, can you just play the anthem as we go out, please? Have so much fun this weekend. Have a fun weekend off. Safe travels to Spa. We can't wait to see all that unfolds. As always, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you here on Unlapped. We'll be back next week.